I just want to start with some things. I want to review some things to see what you remember and what you don't, because I don't know what you remember or don't. I'm going to go over a few things, and I'll try also to make a list of things. We went over who wrote the books, right?
Yes, we did.
Yes. Like if I say to you, who wrote the book of Ruth?
Hello.
Yes. If I said who wrote the book of Ruth? Oh, somebody just joined now? Amadalina. So does anybody remember who wrote the book of Ruth according to the Talmudic tradition?
It was Green.
Green? What do you mean by green?
Ruth Green.
No, I don't think we've talked about Book of Ruth in Talmudic tradition. We've talked about the Babylonian Talmud, the Talmud of Joseph.
Oh, we talked about.
Hanasi.
Well, we actually did. We read the part in the Talmud where it says who wrote every book.
I really don't remember about the.
Okay, so Ruth was the prophet Samuel.
Samuel.
Prophet Samuel. You have that in the in your pages. Okay, let me just see some more things here. I have to write it in question form for you to remember to go over this stuff. Okay, do you remember some of the books that were debated whether they should be part of the Bible or not? There were at least 4 books that were debated whether they should be part of the Bible. Okay, you'll have to go over that, the stuff that I gave you. It's definitely in there. Okay. Let's see what else. The translations of the Bible. We talked a little bit about the translations. What was the first translation of the Hebrew Bible? Into what language?
Wasn't it Septuaginta in Greek?
That's correct. In Greek, around 250, almost 300 before the common era.
Ptolemy the second.
Right.
That was from Alexandria.
That's correct. And even though it was
mentioned in
done,
letter of Aristea.
very good. And even though it was done by Jewish scholars, because it was forced on these scholars, the tradition was not kept among the Jews. It was actually kept among the church fathers. What was the second translation to the Hebrew Bible after the Septuagint? Or I'll make it easier. In what language was it? During the Second Temple period, there was another translation of the Hebrew Bible. Okay, what I will do is I'll make a list of questions to prepare you for the questions. Okay. Yeah, it'll include much more than what's in the test, but at least that way you'll know how to go over the notes. Anybody know what trend? During the Second Temple period, there was actually more than one, but there's a very famous translation of the Bible, which is used actually until this day, and which was written in the Second Temple period, but there was actually
in Aramaic. I'm not so
That's
sure.
correct. In Aramaic, it was Aramaic. Does anybody know the name of that translation? It was called the translation of Onkelos. Onkelos. It's actually a Greek name, and Onkelos lives probably the 1st century at the end of the Second Temple period, and he translates the Bible into the 5 books of Moses into Aramaic. And there's another translation of the prophets by Jonathan, son of Uzziel, Jonathan, the son of Uzziel. And there were another 2 translations into Aramaic aside from that, of the prophets and the later writings. Okay. Aside from that, I mean, during the, after that period, the Bible was translated into many languages, but mostly by the church. The Jews only started translating the Bible into modern languages in the last 150 years. And maybe just the last 120 years. But all the other translations were done by the church. Yeah. Okay, let's see what else, what other topics here. Mhm. Yes, I remember. Okay, this I can't. Okay, you know what I'll have to do, I think. Okay, another question. I think I talked about, we have a holiday called Shavuot, Pentecost, which we call the holiday of the giving of the Torah. Aside from the fact that the Bible calls it the holiday of the first fruit and the Bikurim, and also the holiday of the harvest, but we call it the holiday of the giving of the Torah. Does anybody remember why it's called the holiday of the giving of the Torah? Let's see if anybody remembers that. Not everybody at the same time, just one. Okay. So I'll tell you, according to our tradition, the Decalogue was spoken to the Israelites when they left Egypt on the 6th day of Sivan, of the Hebrew month of Sivan. And now the Bible actually doesn't say when Pentecost is. It says you count 50 days from Passover. And our tradition is to count 50 days from the second day of Passover, because the first day is a holiday, and from the second day, it's work is permitted again. So we count 50 days from the second day of Passover, which always comes out on our calendar to the 6th day of the Hebrew month of Sivan. And that's why Pentecost or Shavuot will always come out on the Hebrew calendar around on the 6th of Sivan for sure. Now, interestingly enough, on the Orthodox Christian calendar, it always comes out within that week. So obviously, they also have it timed out somehow in the same way that we do. Because, for instance, Easter doesn't fall even close. But Pentecost, I noticed that the Orthodox Pentecost usually falls, if not on the same day, then maybe 2-3 days earlier or later, which I always found interesting. But that's the saying of the Decalogue. When actually the Torah was given, I think we talked about that the Torah was given during those 40 years in the desert. This is also the opinion of Nachmanides. There are two opinions in the Talmud. One opinion that the 5 books of Moses was given as a complete book, and a second opinion that the 5 books of Moses was given piece by piece, scroll by scroll in real time as things happen. Moses would walk into the tabernacle and God would dictate the Torah to him. He would write it down and he would put the pieces together. This is actually the more prominent opinion. But even the opinion that says it was put together as a book in one shot, it would have to be towards the end of the 40 years. So it becomes in book form by the end of the 40 years, and that's why only in the book of Deuteronomy is it referred to as a book. It says the book of the Torah, only in Deuteronomy, which is, of course, Moses' last oration to the Israelites, which is towards the end of the 40 years. Okay, let's see what else. Where to go here? Okay, where's this one I was looking at? Let's see for more things. Okay. Okay. The Hebrew chronology, we count the years from the beginning of mankind, and this year is 5,782. Are you familiar with that? The Hebrew chronology, well, obviously the Gregorian chronology, we are in 2022. I say Gregorian because the calendar, as you know, has changed.
Gregorian, yes.
Right, you have the Julian calendar, the Gregorian calendar, and of course, which is a solar calendar. And the Hebrew calendar is both solar and lunar. It's first and foremost lunar because the Hebrew months are either 29 or 30 days based on the orbit of the moon around planet Earth, which takes 29.5 days. That's why every Hebrew month, one is 29, one is 30, 29, 30, 29, 30. In that sense, it's a totally lunar calendar. Because it's a lunar calendar, in order to protect the calendar from the problems that the Muslims have, because as you know, the lunar calendar is 11 days shorter than the solar calendar. So if you only follow a lunar calendar, your holidays are going to move 11 days backwards in the seasons every year. So one year Ramadan will be in the summer, then it'll be in the spring, and then it'll be in the winter, and then it'll be in the fall, and it'll be back in the summer. So it keeps moving. But the Bible calls Passover the holiday of the spring. And because Passover is called the holiday of the spring, and it says in the Bible, remember that in that month of the spring, you left Egypt. So we have to make sure that all our holidays are in the right season. And Pentecost is the holiday of the harvest, and Tabernacles, Sukkot, is the holiday of the ingathering of the crops. So everything has to be in its season. And therefore, in the Hebrew calendar, we have what's called a leap year. If you want to know exactly, I'll show you how it works. You're not going to remember it, but I'll show you how it works anyhow. So let's do it this way. In the Hebrew calendar, as I said, there are 300. Okay, I can't write on this board. It's too difficult. Let me take one of these guys. Hold on a second. I have to close this, and start again. Okay. Now I'll open it up. Here. Okay. There are 365 days in a solar year. Still in Hebrew. 360. Sorry. $365 days in a solar year. He's going back and forth from Hebrew to English. Hold on. And there are 354 days, a lunar. 1 second. Take me some time to get it back into English. Hold on. Okay. You have 354 days in a lunar year. Why? Because every month is either you have 29 days of 6 months, then you have 30 days, because each one is 29 and a half, 30 days, 6 months. So how much is 30 times 6? If you want to say
180.
Okay, so you have 29 times 6 is 174. And then 30 times 6 is 180. So altogether it is 354. Okay. So that's why there are 354 days in a lunar year. A lunar year means 12 months, 12 lunar months. Now, because of that, there is an 11-day discrepancy, 11.25 day discrepancy between the solar year and the lunar year. So in the Hebrew calendar, what we do is we have a month is added 7 times in a 19-year cycle. The Talmud calls it the secret of the calendar. And they call it the secret of the calendar because the Hebrew calendar is quite exact. I mean, the proof is we've had the Hebrew calendar for 5,782 years. Well, actually, we had it from somewhere in the middle of the Second Temple. Okay. But the point is we didn't have to change it under Gregory. So obviously it's a pretty good calendar. Remember, the Julian calendar had to be changed. There was 11, I think more than 11 days, about 15 days or something like that, right? That's the difference between, you have the, well, I think you celebrate Christmas on the 25th, but you have the Russian Orthodox who celebrated January 7th or 8th or something like that because they're still on the Julian calendar. So, yeah. So in the Hebrew calendar, in order to save from that problem, you have a leap year 7 times in 19 years. And what they do is they add on the month of Adar. Month of Adar is the last month before Nisan. Nisan is when Passover is. So if you double the month of Adar, you're pushing Passover forward in the season. And so we add an extra month of Adar 7 times in a 19-year cycle. And it's called second Adar. That means if you were born in second Adar, you will be approximately 1/3 the age of all your peers, because you're going to only have a birthday 7 times in 19 years.
Oh, wow.
So, well, it doesn't actually work that way, but whatever. I mean, that's now another thing about it, so that's the way the Hebrew calendar does. The Hebrew calendar also, and sometimes they also add, remember, some months are 30 days, some are 29. It's also the 7 leap years in 19 works almost exactly, and therefore there are certain years where we add another day, we have another 30-day month if necessary. It's all calculated. All the calculations of the calendar were finished already by the they were finished already by the 2nd century of the Common Era, but the calendar became fixed in the 4th century, what was called 4th Hillel. So he fixed the calendar, but even before him, during the time of Rabbi Gamliel II, there was already a fixed calendar which was known, even though they still used to see the new moon by testimony. Okay, but what about the calendar itself? So we say that we're in 5,782 since the beginning, since creation. 5,782. So what's 5,700? By the way, the church, also the Catholic Church, talks about approximately 5,000 to 6,000 years. I don't remember exactly since creation. However, in the Jewish tradition, the enumeration 5,782 is not a dogma. It was a calculation. It was done by a fellow in the Second Temple period, the Tanaic scholars, whose name was Yossi ben Chalafta. And he actually wrote a book called Seder Olam, which means the way of the world, or the Seder is the order of the world. Seder Olam is the order of the world. What he does is he tries to calculate all the years from the beginning of the book of Genesis, from the time that Adam and Eve were kicked out of the Garden of Eden, and he enumerates the years and based on biblical text, and he does it all the way to his time, which is 1st century of the Second Temple period. Based on his calculation, we are at 5,782 years of Yossi ben Chalafta, who lived in this at the end of the Second Temple period. What's interesting about this calculation is that the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah, when it talks about Rosh Hashanah is Jewish New Year's. And when we count, we enumerate the years always from the first day of the month of Tishrei, which is Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah is Tishrei, day 1 and day 2, which is Jewish New Year. The Talmud says, why is it on Tishrei day 1 or day 2? Because when we enumerate the years, we enumerate them from the creation of Adam. Basically from the 6th day of creation. So that the enumeration, 5,782 years, starts from the 6th day of creation, basically when Adam and Eve left the garden. Which according to the Talmud all happened on that same day. They were created on the 6th day, they sinned on the 6th day, they left the garden on the 6th day, everything happened on the 6th day. They called names to the animals on the 6th day. So everything happened on the 6th day, which of course comes through to the thought that maybe that 6th day was a long day, which I think I mentioned earlier in this course, that there's a lot of reason to think that those 6 days of creation might have been longer than 24 hours. For the simple reason that the sun and the moon and the stars were only created on day 4. And today, the simple calculation of a day is based on the rotation of the earth on its axis vis-a-vis the sun. So it is quite difficult to understand what a day 1, 2, or 3 would be without the sun. So that when the Talmud says that the calculation of the beginning of the universe starts with the beginning of mankind, and it seems to imply when man, meaning Adam and Eve, left the Garden of Eden, it seems to lead to this speculation that possibly the 6 days were longer than 24 hours. This is actually an interesting debate. The Kabbalists, most Jewish Kabbalists take the opinion that the 6 days were much longer than 6 times 24 hours, if not thousands of years. Among the Jewish philosophers, there's a debate. But the Kabbalists, except for Nachmanides, most of them seem to imply that the 6 days were a very long period of time.
What is your opinion?
What is my opinion?
Yes.
Well, my opinion is really based on the source. Since I wasn't there, so I can only really try to base my opinion on the sources that I've read, and I think it makes a lot of sense. In a sense, when you say that we're enumerating from when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, remember what came before mankind is almost irrelevant for us, because if there are no human beings, then how is it relevant? Whatever the world was before Adam and Eve were created, and they were created at the end of creation on the 6th day. So what was before, I think, is sort of irrelevant. That's God's world before we showed up. Whatever God wanted to do, he could do. So, and why has he put us at the end? Hopefully because we are the crown of creation. Unfortunately, look at human beings, we have both possibilities. We can be the crown and we can be the dung, but we have to strive to be the crown. My personal feeling is that I think the Kabbalists are right, that there probably was longer periods of time before. And this, of course, makes it easier to understand scientific cosmogony, which talks about millions of years of creation of the universe. That's okay. It doesn't bother me if you talk about God creating the universe billions of years ago, and even creating mankind millions of years ago. Because then I can always say that the Torah, the man that God is talking to, is the first Homo sapiens, meaning mankind the way we understand mankind. And whatever happened before in this process of creating a human being, see, it doesn't, to quote Samson Raphael Hirsch, who was a rabbi in Germany in the 19th century, but I'm going to paraphrase what he's saying. When Samson Raphael Hirsch heard about evolution for the first time, he said to me, it doesn't bother me if God created the universe spontaneously or evolution, as long as God created the universe. I don't care how he did it. That's his issue. That's not my issue. So I'm going to say the same thing. If God wanted to create human beings in unusual ways until we became what we became, that doesn't bother me. And I don't actually see that as a problem. In general, in Judaism, we did not have dogmas about how the natural world is supposed to be. And I think the Catholic Church ran into lots of problems by adopting such dogmas. And I don't think it's a healthy thing to do. In general, science and religion deal with different issues. Science is about how the world works, and religion is why the world is here in the first place. And that's a very different question. It's a philosophical question. Religious questions are also philosophical questions. You know, if you go to a biologist and you say to them, what is biology? They'll tell you biology is the study of life. And then you say, okay, what is life? So that's a philosophical question. So, in other words, a biologist doesn't have to answer the question, what is life? They have to answer the question of how living organisms function, right? But what is life or why is life? That's a philosophical question. So in theory, actually, science and religion shouldn't actually have to, shouldn't really have contradictions. The only reason they do, by the way, is because there's a book called Genesis. And in Genesis, there is a description, A, that says that God created the universe, and B, that seems to assume he created it in 6 days, unless, as I said before, you understand 6 days as a metaphor. Most Christian interpretations before the 19th century were not comfortable using the term metaphor. Among the Protestants, you find towards the end of the 19th century, this idea of, what do they call it, intelligent design, that maybe God created the universe through an intelligent pattern of evolution. You have already Christian thinkers among the Protestants who are talking that way in the 19th century. You have even Jewish thinkers who are talking that way, even though that most Jews didn't know what evolution was at the end of the 19th century because they weren't really in universities. But the ones who were familiar with it, that's more or less the, they had no problem with the idea of intelligent design. I wrote a few articles about this. If you want to know more about it, I actually have a book that I think there's a copy of, if I can find it. I think you have a copy in there, Bucharest University. Where's the book? It should be here somewhere. It's not here. No. Oh, can't even find my own book. Hold on. One moment. Okay, this book, I know you have at least one copy. It was put out by Sefer. That's you know, the printing press of the Jewish community in Bucharest. I guess Felicia would know. I could always call them and ask if they have more copies. And here I also deal with a lot of questions, including the question of science and Judaism. Which I want to point out something interesting. Once we're talking about this, it's not. I just think it's an interesting topic because I've written about it a lot. But in the 19th century, one of the reasons that evolution became such a big topic for religionists was due to the fact that, I remember you had the French Revolution, the end of the 18th century. And the French Revolution not only wanted to replace the monarchy, but they also wanted to replace the church. It was a double battle. In fact, it was more a battle against the church than the monarchs, because the French Revolution started by mistake. People were hungry, and when they ran into the palace in Versailles during the time of Louis, all they really wanted was to tell him that we need food. They didn't run in order to take over the palace, but one thing led to another, and sometimes you have a domino effect, you just can't stop it anymore. And so it happened, and the monarchy was gone. And then there was really chaos. in France for quite a while until the Napoleonic era. I mean, the guillotine was working day in, day out. Everybody was a traitor, and this guy was a traitor, and everybody was a traitor. It was terrible. So until the Napoleonic era, and you had a few Napoleons, you had a mess really in France. But one of the outcomes of the French Revolution was also fight against the church, because the Catholic Church had owned a lot of land. They were extremely powerful, and they, like the kings, were seen as just power seekers who were not really interested in the people. So that scientists in the Middle Ages very often were very religious people. The first time we have anti-religious scientists is in the 19th century after the French Revolution. And even the scientists who the Catholic Church ostracized, like Galileo, were very religious people. They didn't, or Copernicus, it was the church's problem. It wasn't Galileo's problem. So actually, Galileo was vindicated in the 20th century by the Pope, and not so long ago. I think it was 1964. But Galileo, Bruno. So it wasn't their fault that the church had a dogma that planet Earth has to be in the middle of the solar system. They were just, looking for things. But a lot of these people, were very religious people. Newton wrote a whole treatise about metaphysics, and Isaac Newton. And Gregorius Mendel was actually a priest. And Charles Darwin, by the way, was actually interested in studying to become a Protestant minister before he decided to go into biology and zoology. You should know that. And by the way, at the end of his book, The Origin of Species, like in a few last pages there, I forget exactly where. So he writes something like, some people might think that my book, has implications against monotheism. Says, but I don't see it that way. It's like it was others who used his theories, but he didn't actually see it that way. Maybe he was being a little bit, I don't know, acting out of innocence, but whatever. But at least that it's interesting that he does write that in his book. But you did have figures in France who were part of the Lumière, part of the Enlightenment in France at the time, who saw opportunities to use science against the church. One of the famous cases is Pierre Laplace, who was an evolutionist in the second half of the 19th century. And when he was asked about what is the role of God in the theory of evolution, his answer was, I have no need of such hypotheses in science. But people didn't talk that way until the 19th century. So a lot of it was political more than scientific, if you understand what I'm saying. There was a lot of things going on. It's like almost like if you listen to Christopher Hitchens, if you've ever heard, you can still hear him on YouTube. He wrote a book called God is Not Great. Christopher Hitchens. He was an Englishman living in the United States. He and Richard Dawkins, Richard Dawkins wrote a book called The God Delusion. He had two of these guys. Dawkins is still around. Hitchens is not. But when you hear Hitchens, if you listen very closely, okay, he's not a religious person in any sense, but most of his problems are not with God, but with people. Meaning the way people used religion. That's really, if you listen closely to what he's saying. So he's really attacking what I call the shortcomings of religious establishments. He's not really attacking the idea of belief, if you pay attention to what he's saying. So anyhow, whereas, for instance, Richard Dawkins is different. Richard Dawkins is just a secular scientist.
Is this guy Harari, Yuval Harari from, I think
Yuval Harari from Hebrew U, yeah.
Yeah, and he wrote books about the history of mankind.
Yes. Yeah, I have to say, first of all, I apologize. I did not read his books, but I have heard him speak.
Yeah, me neither. I haven't, but I was curious if somebody did, or you did, to see how he treats this religion.
Yeah, he's not a religious person, Harari. It's a little hard for me to keep up with everybody writing in a book because then I won't have any time left to do anything else. I probably should, only because his book became very popular. Well, I don't know what to say, really. Even if I read the book and I disagreed, I would not write an article against him. It's not, what's the point? It's just somebody's opinion. So, I mean, it's more important to try to understand, if you're looking for the issues of science and religion, it's not so much what Mr. So-and-so says. It's, what is the data today and how do people understand the data? Because remember, there's the difference between science and scientism is how you understand the data. You have people are people. A lot of people have agendas. And so they will use the same data and come out with different ideas. So in the 19th century, when you had scientists who were really angry at the church, especially in France at the time. So for them, the theory of evolution was a delight. We finally have something to get rid of this creation story, which has stuck with us since Genesis. You know that the French Revolution, one of the first things that they did was change the calendar. Instead of 7 days in a week, they decided there would be 10 days in a week. Now, why change from 7 to 10? Because 7 days of the week is based on the book of Genesis. So every time you have a 7-day week, it reminds you of the book of Genesis and that God created the universe in 7 days. And this drove them crazy. So, because remember, a day is 24 hours because it takes 24 hours for the earth to rotate on its axis. A month is approximately 30 days because it takes 29 and a half days for the moon to go around the earth. And a year is 365 days because it takes 365 and a quarter days for the earth to go around the sun. But a week is 7 days because it says so in the book of Genesis. You understand? Which is actually very surprising because the whole world keeps 7-day weeks. But so for the French, after the French Revolution, this really bothered them. So they created a 10-day week. And there were 3 weeks in a month. The only problem is it drove people crazy. When am I supposed to rest? What am I supposed to do? What's a 10-day week? That means I missed 1 day of rest for every month at least. That's not fair. Okay, it didn't work. It fell apart. But the whole idea was this, almost like a hatred. It's like it was a real. I mean, if the church attacked evolution, it's because they were under attack. So I don't blame them for that. They were under attack, and they realized it, and they had to fight back. But when you're under attack, you don't think objectively. And that's why evolution was dealt with very strangely. Because I can tell you, for instance, the problem of an anthropocentric universe, different than a heliocentric universe, right? Today, science shows the universe as being heliocentric with the sun in the middle. And at one time we thought under Ptolemy that the earth was in the middle, what we call anthropocentric, anthro mean man in the middle. So the funny thing is, when it was discovered that earth is not in the center, among Jewish thinkers, nobody had a problem with that. But the church had a dogma, so they didn't know what to do with it. I'm just saying the Jewish thinkers didn't have a dogma because it didn't matter. Okay, so we found out something we didn't know. What exactly is going to change now? We don't live on other planets anyhow. So it depends, how important it is. I would say the same thing would have happened with the theory of evolution if it wasn't for the fight that was already in progress between the French scientists and philosophers like, help me out. What's his name again?
We're talking about Enlightenment philosophers or what?
Yes, the famous one who was
Voltaire.
Voltaire. Thank you. Yes, Candide, in his book Candide. So people like Voltaire and people like Laplace, both philosophers and scientists, who tried to mock the church. I mean, in Candide. Okay, I mean, I probably would never be in the Catholic Church, but if I was at the time, I guess I would be offended by Candide. I understand that. So I'm just saying that, there was a battle going on. There was an ideological battle aside from the other battles, political, that was going on at the time. So it's not surprising that evolution became the banner of the fight against religion, even though it really did not have to be. But what happened in evolution in the 19th century, by the way, is that, remember, there were a lot of things that were not clear. Evolution, first of all, was a theory. Its basis was based on zoology. So it was not, it wasn't based on physics at the time. And people also were not sure about things. Like, for instance, can there be, the Bible seems to talk about spontaneous creation. But spontaneous creation for the Bible was God. So the question was, can there be spontaneous creation without God? Right? This was one of the questions of the 19th century. Now, since biology had not developed very well until the end of the 19th century, so people try to prove, scientists try to prove, biologists, that you could have spontaneous creation even without God. For instance, you take a piece of meat and you put it into a vacuum and you seal it. And a week later, there are worms. There you are, spontaneous creation, because they never knew what bacteria was. Okay. Until they discovered bacteria, a lot of people thought you could have spontaneous creation. I put a piece of meat, there was nothing there, and all of a sudden, you have all these creatures that emerge from the meat. Okay, when they discovered that there's bacteria, so they realized spontaneous creation doesn't work. Or another argument that was at the 19th century, question of accidental creation. Can there be accidental creation? So the argument was like this. If you take a monkey and you give the monkey a typewriter, if you remember what a typewriter was, once upon a time, click, 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 yeah. It's basically the keyboard without the computer. So so you had these, right? So if you gave a monkey a typewriter and paper, and the monkey would click, 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 and the monkey had infinite time. Eventually, the monkey would be click, click, clicking Shakespeare. Because in infinite time, the possibility of Shakespeare coming out just by random in infinite time will happen. Eventually, okay? Because you're talking about infinite time. So it's going click, 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 click for infinite time, yeah? And you'll also have Mihai Ionescu, all his poems, click, click, click for the monkey, eventually. So that was another argument that was used in the 19th century to talk about accidental. The only problem is the scientific world, with the discovery of nuclear science, changed the whole scenario. And the way they changed the scenario was in a few ways. As I said, number one, they understood that spontaneous creation is not in such a pattern. And the second thing was they realized there's not infinite time. Just to give you an example, in 1946, after the Second World War, there was a Russian scientist of Jewish origin who made his way to the United States, and his name was George Gamow. Gamow was a scientist who also liked writing children's books. That was his hobby. But he wrote an article in 1946, a scientific article, where he, based on the ideas of Einstein, remember Einstein's E equals mc squared means that energy can become matter and matter can become energy. By the way, you can find on YouTube Einstein actually describing this. So, I just saw that the other day. Okay, so that energy becomes matter, matter becomes energy. So if matter can become energy and energy can become matter, so Gamow hypothesized that maybe the world of matter that we know started but from very condensed energy. And so he said, if you took matter and turned it into energy, it would have to be very condensed. And therefore, at some point, maybe this energy was so condensed that it just blew up. And when it blew up, it turned itself eventually into matter. When he published this paper, it was mocked by the scientific community. And because they thought it was such a crazy idea, they nicknamed it the Big Bang as a joke. Big Bang was a joke. It was a derogatory way to talk about Galoff's ideas. But what happened was in 1971, there were two scientists by the name of Wilson and Penzias who won a Nobel Prize for proving the Big Bang and the way they proved it was one of the theory of the Big Bang speculated that there would be a certain amount of energy in the universe in a uniform pattern, and even speculated how much based on the amount of time that probably has passed since the beginning of the Big Bang. And Wilson and Penzias found this pulsating energy in the universe, and that's how they got the Nobel Prize. Gamow didn't get it because he was dead. You can't win a Nobel Prize if you're not alive. There was one exception, a guy in Toronto a few years ago, because he had already gotten the prize before he passed away, but normally you have to be alive to get the Nobel Prize. But the point is that since the time of the Big Bang Theory, there's not infinite time anymore. So if there's not infinite time, the idea of the monkey typing on the typewriter doesn't work anymore. Aside from the fact that where did he get the typewriter and where did he get the monkey? But I'm just saying that the idea doesn't work anymore. And actually, the Big Bang Theory is a spontaneous creation theory. Now, of course, there are hypotheses where the Big Bang came from. Was it inverted universes and things like that? But the point is that any possible hypothesis is just as good as any other one. So even though the Big Bang Theory is not necessarily the creation story, but it also does not deny it. So I'm just saying in the 20th century, we're in a much better situation vis-a-vis science and biblical religion than we were, let's say, in the 19th century. But for some reason in the 20th century, it still became, I don't know. I think everybody likes staying in their points of view. That's all. Okay, so we're in 5,782. You know that story? After Jewish New Year's 2 years ago, this fellow comes over. It was it was in Jewish New Year's in 2021, 2020 still, 2020. So somebody comes over to the guy and says, were you just at the synagogue for 2 days? Says, yeah, we just had Jewish New Year's. Says, amazing. What year? Said 5,781. Says 5,781. Wow. Can you tell me what happens at the end of 2021, please? Yeah. Okay. As somebody once said, when somebody asked you 5 years ago, how do you see yourself in 5 years? You got it wrong. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So as I said, this enumeration, the way I understand it, is from whatever point that was when Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden. If you want to call that the Homo sapiens, I have no problem with that. We have no writing before 5,000 years anyhow. So the human being that we are familiar with, as opposed to any Ooga Booga man who might have lived in a cave, so really starts approximately 5,000 something, years ago. So I personally don't have a problem with that, but I'm sure there are always people who have problems with something. So that could be something else. Okay, let's see what else. That was just another topic I wanted to talk about. Let me just look more on these pages. Where did they go? No, where did it go? I have to find it now. I think I closed it. Okay, here's one. Let's see. Talk about the translations. So as I said, aside from the Hebrew year, by the way, aside from, as I said, I was talking about the months and the lunar calendar, it's also our holidays are based on the agricultural year. So Passover is in the spring, and it's called the Festival of the Spring. It's also called the Festival of the Unleavened Bread, of course. And also it's called Passover because if you remember, the angel of death passed over the houses of the Israelites and smote the firstborn of the Egyptians. So Passover, also the spring festival. Pentecost or Shavuot, the giving of the Torah, is the festival of the harvest. Because you plant in the spring and you harvest in May, June, which is usually when Shavuot, Pentecost is. And then Sukkot or Tabernacles is called the ingathering of the crops because after you harvest, it sits in the field, dries out during the summer, and then is put into, before the winter months, is put away into the house, into the barn, into whatever place, the silo, wherever you keep your crops. So that for biblical man, these three pilgrim festivals where we go to Jerusalem, according to the book of Deuteronomy, 3 times a year. So these are also the whole agricultural year, from the planting to the reaping to the ingathering of the crops. That really is the whole agricultural year. Basically from April until October is the agricultural year. And these festivals were during this time period. And in agricultural society, these are the times of also festivity. When you're producing things, the winter is the time when you're in the house and trying to survive. The majority of our holidays, by the way, are during that time. Exactly during the time from the time of the planting till the time of the reaping. In fact, basically all our holidays from the Bible are during that time. You have Passover, then you have Shavuot, Pentecost, then you have New Year's, and then you have Yom Kippur, and then you have Tabernacles and Shmini Atzer. They're basically all there. So during the time of the agricultural year, and then you go into the winter. In the winter, we have only rabbinic holidays, which is based on stories which were post-biblical, like Hanukkah, or from the end of the Bible, like Purim and the Scroll of Esther. So to point that out. Okay, let's see. I'm just looking for a few other things that this is sort of like going over a few things just to prepare you for the test, but I will try to put together questions for you also. Just trying to see if there are any things I forgot. Okay. Another thing, this course is called Sacred and Interpretive Texts of Judaism. I'll tell you what I think that means. Okay. You see, everybody knows that the Bible is sacred text. And not just the 5 books of Moses, but also the prophets and the Hagiographa. There are, of course, differences of opinions, whether the books like the Apocrypha, who did not make it into the Bible, in the Jewish tradition, they are not sacred text. In some of the Christian traditions, they are considered sacred text, at least some of them. A question of sacred text. And even in the Jewish tradition, there was arguments about 4 books that finally did make their way into the Bible. 3 of books of Solomon. The question was, is this the wisdom of Solomon, or was it written under divine inspiration? Look at the book of Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Proverbs. Eventually, they did make it into the canon of the Bible. And of course, the book of Esther. The question was, is the book of Esther just an important story, or is it under divine inspiration? I think I talked about this. So even in the Jewish Bible, there was questions about those books, which eventually did make their way into the Bible. And they were also written at the right time, before the Bible was sealed. But when we talk about, but in the Jewish tradition, when we talked about sacred text, it's not only the text which is sacred, it's also the interpretation of the text. The oral tradition is the official understanding of biblical text according to Jewish tradition. In other words, it's not that you just have the Bible, the 5 books of Moses. The 5 books of Moses is supposed to be understood in a specific way. This is called the oral tradition, or the Torah Shebaal Peh, the oral tradition of the Torah. And these are the ideas that get written down eventually in the Mishnah and the Talmud. It's the official, if you want to say, sanctified understanding of the text with the arguments. The only thing slightly similar to that you have in the Islam called the Hadith, which literally means the novel or novelle. The only difference, but the Hadith is not exactly the same because it's mostly arguments and interpretations and less actual traditions. And in the Talmud, the arguments are based on actual traditions of how to understand the text. Like we have traditions that the tefillin is supposed to be a box with 4 parts, with 4 parchments in it. And if you look back at the tefillin that were found in Masada or in Qumran from 2,000 years ago, they're made the same way our tefillin is. So this was an ancient tradition that was already known in the Second Temple period. So even our tradition, for instance, of using the citron, the etrog, on the festival of tabernacles, of Sukkot, as that fruit, because the Bible says a nice fruit, it doesn't say which fruit. And our tradition, we know, goes back at least to the 2nd century before the Common Era, because the Mishnah tells a story that Agrippus II, when he did something in the temple service, which was considered wrong because he was following not the Pharisaic tradition, but the Sadducees, it says that the people stoned him with their etrogs, with their citrons. So that means on the Festival of Tabernacles on Sukkot. So already in the 2nd century before the Common Era, they were using that type of fruit, which is indigenous to the land of Israel, as the fruit mentioned by the Bible in the book of Exodus and Leviticus. So even though the Bible just says a nice fruit, Pietz Adar, it doesn't say which one. So these traditions were live traditions, and the Talmud brings us a lot of these live traditions. We might have known them without the Talmud only because we kept them from generation to generation, but we wouldn't know where they came from without the Talmud. It's a good thing these books were put together, because we would have been in the dark about a lot of these traditions. And so in that sense, we're lucky. I mean, the Talmud was really a phenomenal achievement of, we know so much about the Second Temple period. We know not only the religious practice, we even know what they ate and what they dressed and where they went and what they did. And it's like literally, it's so much detail, because you have 40 volumes of Talmudic discussion, not only about Jewish law, but about all of Jewish life during the Second Temple period, both in the land of Israel and Palestine, and even to a certain extent in Alexandria. So it really is quite, it's really a lot of knowledge about that period. Unfortunately, we don't have as much knowledge about the First Temple period. We only have what the Bible tells us and what archaeology is able to substantiate. It's just far back. But the very fact that we have so much from the Second Temple period is actually quite amazing, because historically we don't have that much. For instance, without the book of Josephus, we would know very little about the Second Temple period. This guy just liked to write. And he even wrote things that the Romans didn't pay him to write. So the war against the Romans, they paid him to write. But the Antiquities, it was just his idea. He wrote the book, and he told us lots of things that some of them we didn't even know existed, like the story of Masada. which the Talmud is silent about because they didn't like the story of Masada. Doesn't sound so good that all the Jews decided to commit suicide. Not exactly the type of story you want to educate your children about. So the Talmud is totally silent about the Masada story, but we're told it by Josephus, and then it was discovered in the 1950s from the air, the place where it actually took place. And other things about the arguments between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Talmud talks about it a little bit, but doesn't go into great detail, but Josephus does. And about the Essenes, which are not mentioned in the Talmud, you talk about the things you want to talk about. But we also learned a lot of interesting things from Josephus too. For instance, that the people followed the Pharisees and thought that the Sadducees were just the aristocrats, right? Josephus says it both in the Antiquities and in the in the book of the Jewish war against Rome. So, which are also interesting details that we didn't know without Josephus's point of view. Okay. What else would I wanted to say something else too. 1 second, what was it? I have to remember. Yeah. One other thing. I think I talked about once in one of the early talks about how do we save the Bible from broken telephone? You know that game that children play called Broken Telephone? One child whispers something into another child's ear and he whispers another. And by the time you get to the end of the circle, they say, okay, what did he say? And it comes out totally different than what the first person said. So 2 questions. Question number 1 is, how was the 5 books of Moses and the 8 books of the prophets, there are more than 8, but it's called the 8 books, and the 11 books of the Hagiographa, how are they saved from the problem of broken telephone? So we know today of a few ways that this was done. Number 1, there was the practical way. Remember, we read the 5 books of Moses every Sabbath in the synagogue. And if you make a mistake, the reader has to go over the word. If you left out a word, he has to go back to the beginning of the pericopa. And then read again. Okay, so it was very meticulous. You had to read it. And if the book of the Torah, the scroll of Torah, had something written improperly, it had to be closed, put back into the ark, and another scroll had to be taken until it was fixed. So in that sense, they're very meticulous that it had to be, that's one thing. Now, we know that during the time of Ezra, at the beginning of the Second Temple period, Ezra was called Ezra the scribe. Ezra comes back from Babylonia together with Zerubbabel and Nehemiah and Ezra, who is a Kohen, who is a priest. And we know also from the Bible that the priests were the teachers. So he's called the scribe because of the fact that he took the various copies of the 5 books of Moses that were known at the time and tried to look for the best tradition. So, and supposedly he spent a lot of time with this, and he's called Ezra the scribe. The Talmud actually goes into detail about that. It seems that there were problems during the Babylonian exile. We don't know a lot of details about what happened during the Babylonian exile, but the Talmud points this out. Now, but still, but that's about the 5 books of Moses. Now, this to some extent must have worked. And I say, why do I say it must have worked? First of all, Jews were most meticulous about the 5 books of Moses because Jewish law is based on the 5 books of Moses. So therefore, even one letter mistake in the 5 books of Moses was considered not good. There is a book, for instance, just to give you an example, published in the 13th century, and the book was called Achla ve'Achla, which literally means she ate and she ate. This is not a cookbook. The book is actually, it was used for scribes who wrote the 5 books of Moses because it's written with a quill, with a pen on parchment. And it was basically a collection of how to write the different words of the Bible. So they would take the roots of the Hebrew words, they would write based on each root, according to alphabet, what are all the different words in the Bible and how exactly to write them in order to preserve the tradition of how to write that word. Do you add the vav or do you take away the vav, for instance? And these books were very popular in order to teach scribes how to write. This is even before the printing press, of course. After the printing press, it gets much easier. So we know about that too. We also know, for instance, in the 10th century, that there were two families who lived in the land of Israel who did research on the tradition. One of them was called the Asher family, and the other one was called the Naphtali family. And the Asher family had a very famous Torah scroll that they claimed went back for generations, tradition all the way to Ezra. This Torah scroll, by the way, is mentioned by Maimonides in the 12th century. The Torah scroll was found its way to Aleppo, Syria, Khalib, and it was eventually known as the Aleppo Codex, or in Hebrew, Keter, which means a crown. Keter Aram Tzova. Aram Tzova is the biblical name for Syria. Abraham went through Aram Naharaim, which was Syria of his time, and later was called Aram Tzova. Anyhow, so right, he goes from Mesopotamia to Syria to Canaan. So the Aleppo Codex was actually a scroll from the Bnei Asher family from the 10th century. And it was in Aleppo until 1948. 1948, with the rise of the state of Israel, there was what we would call a pogrom in Syria against the Jewish community. They were burning houses and synagogues, and they burnt the synagogue where the Aleppo Codex was. When the synagogue was burned, people thought that was the end of the Aleppo Codex. But what happened was, in the 1950s, there was an Arab merchant who sold some pieces of the Aleppo Codex. If I remember correctly, it might have been to Solomon Schechter. Some of it was Solomon Schechter, who was the famous researcher originally from Moldova and made his way to, then he was in Oxford, I think. Then he was in the United States. He was also the one who discovered the Cairo Geniza. But, and other ones were found in Israel by different people. And they realized that there were different merchants with different fragments. And these fragments were from the Aleppo Codex. So the government decided to put out money and look for the fragments, and they offered money for anybody who could find fragments. And they started getting fragments from all these different merchants who had it in their house. And it was all put together. Today it's in the Israel Museum. And they have 1/3 of the Aleppo Codex. 1/3 of the Aleppo Codex. What was important about the Aleppo Codex is not only did it have the letters of the 5 books of Moses, because normally a Torah scroll is not written with vowels, but this one was written with vowels. So in that sense, it was very important. You had both not only the letters, but also how to pronounce the letters. But as I said, we have 1/3 of the Aleppo Codex, 2/3 is missing, but at least that 1/3 is enough to make a comparison with our text today. Let me say something about our text today. We have 3 texts of the 5 books of Moses: the Ashkenazic text, the Spanish Sephardic text, and the Yemenite text. The differences are minor. There are no differences in words, but there are some differences in letters. Between the Ashkenazic and the Spanish, you have 1 letter difference. In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 23, there is a word daka. The Ashkenazians spell it with an aleph, and the Sephardim spell it with a hey. It's not a major difference. It's the same pronunciation, but it's still obviously a problem for somebody who is interested in keeping the exact text. The Yemenite Torah scrolls have 8 letters which are different. The Yemenite communities, by the way, have been in Yemen since the First Temple period, according to their tradition. And their Torah scroll has 8 letters difference. The interesting thing is that the Aleppo Codex seems to agree with some of the 8-letter differences. So that's something of interest. But anyhow, so this is so basically the biggest discrepancy is 8 letters, but no words are different. When you go on and try to compare the other parts of the Bible, so then we have, let's say, the book of Isaiah, once we're passing the 5 books of Moses. So, of course, we have fragments in the Dead Sea Scrolls of the whole Bible, but fragments, except for Isaiah. The Dead Sea Scrolls has a complete book of Isaiah, which you can see on view again in the Israel Museum in facsimile form. And when you compare the book of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls are anywhere from the 2nd century before the Common Era to the 1st century of the Common Era. It's not clear. They were found in Qumran by the Essenes, who probably lived there in the 1st century, but it could be much older than that. And so the book of Isaiah basically is word for word our book of Isaiah. There are slight discrepancies. As I said, Jews were less meticulous in the prophets than they were in the 5 books of Moses. So if you have a word here, a word there, but it's basically the same text. When you go further on, like the book of Psalms, there are some words which are different, not just letters. Like sometimes God's name is Elohim, sometimes it's the Tetragrammaton, and this discrepancy in the book of Isaiah, in the prophets, we don't have discrepancies in our official Masoretic text. In the book of Psalms, there are a few things which are just different traditions. But here, a word there, basically, and not very much. So it's interesting when you talk about, so a lot of attempts were made to preserve the word, because remember, even if you believe that the Bible is the word of God, you want to make sure you have the same word that you had 3,000 years ago. And so this, therefore, Jews were very meticulous about preserving, especially the 5 books of Moses, after that, the prophets, and after that, the Hagiographa. Even the oral tradition is its own issue, but the oral tradition itself, through its own discussions, is always looking for the exact traditions, and there are various views. Okay, what else? Let's see this. There are other things here. I want to bring out. Oops, sorry. Where did it go? Oh, here it is. Okay, 2 other things, and then that'll be it. Did I talk about the commentaries on the Bible? I don't remember. I think I might have. And let's go back to the text that we use normally, and then I'll show you what I mean. I just don't remember if we talked about it, but I think we did. Okay, can you see that? It says Rishonim, the early rabbis.
Yes, and I do remember when we
Yes.
talked now.
I talked about Bible exegesis, right?
Yes.
Okay, so let me just run through that just again. The question I had asked is, how come from the 11th century, all of a sudden we have commentaries on the 5 books of Moses, something we didn't have for generations before that. We did have midrashic commentaries. We did have translations like Onkelos, but there didn't seem to be a need for other commentaries until the 11th century, which is 2,000 years after the Bible was given. So I raised that question, and what I said was that the early commentaries of the 11th century to the 12th century were commentaries that were trying to look for the simple meaning of the text. The reason why commentaries were so interested in the simple meaning of the text was because of debates that were going on, not exactly debates, but controversies that were going on in Europe at the time. As I said, in the 11th century, you had the early Christian commentaries, especially of the Catholic Church, and that were being written in France and England. And because of this, there were Jews who felt that it was important to give the Jewish opinion of the simple meaning of the text in order to deal with these other commentaries. Like Joseph Bechor Shor, who is writing in France in the 11th century, is really arguing against certain Christian commentaries at the time who were challenging the simple meaning of the Bible. Within the Jewish world, in the 10th century, you have the beginning of the Karaites, which is a movement in Judaism, which was sort of a fundamentalist movement, which was against the oral tradition. And since the Karaites were against the oral tradition in Babylonia, they spent most of their time interpreting the simple meaning of the Bible. And since their simple meaning sometimes came out differently than the traditional meaning of the Midrash or the Talmud, so many Jewish interpreters felt that they had to answer the Karaite commentaries, like Abraham Ibn Ezra, like Obadiah Sforno. Ibn Ezra specifically very often even mentions the Karaites in his arguments, and tries to explain why things are not according to their understanding. So this was another reason which provoked the emergence of simple commentary, commentaries on the simple meaning of the text. However, after you had commentaries on the simple meaning of the text, you had other types of commentaries too. You had both Obadiah Sforno and Abraham Ibn Ezra were interested also in philosophical commentaries. You had, for instance, Levi ben Gershon, Rabbag, Levi ben Gershon, known as Gersonides, who writes a philosophical interpretation of the book of Job. Meaning based on Greek philosophy of his day. Even Maimonides has some philosophical interpretations in his Guide for the Perplexed. So these are 13th century. In other words, once people started writing commentaries on the simple meaning, so others wrote commentaries from a philosophical point of view. Once there were commentaries from a philosophical point of view, then you had other commentaries like Nachmanides, wrote commentaries from a Kabbalistic point of view. And he was not the only one. I'm just giving an example. And then you had other commentaries like Rashi, who was interested in writing a commentary based on rabbinic midrash. In other words, I'm going to give you the simple meaning of the text, but where the rabbis have a tradition about the text, I'm going to tell you that too. So basically, you have four types of biblical exegesis from the 11th to about the 15th century. And so, as I said, you have what I call simple, just what's the simple meaning of the text, like Rashbam is simple meaning of the text. Simple meaning of the text. Sforno and Ibn Ezra are interested in the simple meaning of the text. Radak is interested, Kimchi is interested in the simple meaning of the text. But then you have the philosophic interpretations like Ralbag, who's called Gersonides. Levi ben Gershon, just like Gersonides. And then you have Kabbalistic interpretations like Nachmanides. You have rabbinic interpretations like Rashi. If you want, there's also allegorical interpretations. The only well-known one is Philo of Alexandria. So since he's the only one, Philo is very much into allegorical interpretations. And but usually when I talk about four styles of Bible commentary, it's simple, rabbinic, philosophic, Kabbalistic. And you will see this over and over again. In fact, there are even commentators like 14th century Bachya ben Asher, who actually writes the simple meaning of the text, the hints, the midrash, and the Kabbalah. He gives you 4 different possibilities, not on every verse, but on many of the verses. So, so you have that too. So I wanted to point that out. Okay, what else? And is there anything else I wanted to talk about? Hold on. Let me just close this. Let me get back to that thing if I can find it. Is there anything else? Let me see. Okay. Okay, two last things. So one thing is that okay, so why did I call this sacred and interpretive? Because in Judaism, the interpretive tradition is part of the sacred text. It goes hand in hand. In that sense, it's a little bit different than the Christian tradition, but maybe not 100% different, because there are Christian traditions about certain things in the Bible. But we have just lots of them. You might say that the oral tradition is the spectacles through which the Jew is supposed to read the text and understand, especially when it comes to practice, halakha. If it's just coming to interpretation, then it's okay. You can interpret it in different ways. When it comes to Jewish practice, you cannot. That was already established. Last thing. The commandments, very often we look at it as 2 types of commandments, which sometimes we use the term chok and mishpat. Second. So you have the word chok and mishpat. Chok is understood as this was also understood. This was written already by Saadia Gaon in the 10th century. Chok, he calls it. I'll use my own terms. Let me just think of a better word. Mishpat are, let's say, commandments which are self-evident. And chok is non-self-evident. So, what is a self-evident command? Do not kill, do not steal, do not commit adultery, do not lie. They're self-evident because when a human being says that, I understand that this is part of ethics and morality. So things that we consider part of ethics and morality, we consider them self-evident. So we could say, even if the Torah has told us, didn't tell us not to steal, we wouldn't steal anyhow because it seems like the wrong thing to do. There are certain things that a person is born with. So then why do you need it in the Torah? You need it because, as you know, human beings can rationalize anything. Normally, I wouldn't steal, but that guy, it's a mitzvah to steal from him. He's such a rotten person, so he deserves it. Normally, I wouldn't steal, but the government, the taxes they take from me, I mean, everybody's got a reason, you know. There's Mark Twain, has a book called Huckleberry Finn. So Huckleberry Finn and his friend Jim are going on the Mississippi, and it's in the summer, somewhere in August, and it's a really hot day. And Huckleberry says, wait, let's park over here for a moment. So they park at the side and they see this big field of watermelons. Huckleberry says, wow, we got watermelons. So he starts picking up a watermelon. Jim says, wait a second. Don't you think that somebody owns this watermelon field? You can't just take the watermelons and walk off. So Huck says, okay, wait a second. Look how big this field is. Until the owner of this field finds this watermelon, it's going to rot. I'm actually doing him a favor by removing it at this point. Okay, that we call that rationalizing. We want to take the watermelon. We know it's the wrong thing to do, so we have to figure out a way to justify it. That's what the human reason does. So it's like they say a psychopath knows that it's wrong to kill. It just doesn't bother them. Okay. Doesn't bother them because they don't have a conscience, but they know it's wrong. They also know that it's wrong. Every burglar, every criminal knows that it's wrong to steal. It just doesn't bother them. So yeah. Anyhow, so getting back to this. So the term mishpat refers to self-evident mitzvot. So the reason why we need the Torah to talk about the Bible to say self-evident things, because human beings have a tendency to justify everything. And therefore you have to sometimes put an anchor down and say, but it's this way. What about the non-self-evident? The Talmud in Sanhedrin says that you have three categories of mitzvot. You have mitzvot between man and man, commandments between man and man. Most of the commandments between man and man are self-evident. Not to steal, not to lie, not to cheat, etc. Then you have commandments between man and him, herself, yourself. And these commandments are, you're not allowed to take your own life, for instance. Suicide is not allowed. You can get the death penalty. I'm just kidding. Wouldn't help, right, if you were successful. But the point is that even the idea that even your body is not yours. The Bible says you have to be very careful about your own self. You're not allowed to hurt yourself purposely. This idea that God gives life and we have to perpetuate life. Does it have to be perpetuated at all costs? That's the discussion by itself in medical ethics in Judaism. Like, do you have to put a person on a respirator when they are going to die anyhow? That's a discussion, not necessarily, depends on the scenario and the circumstances. Questions of abortion, for instance. If the fetus is going to kill the mother, do you say that you're not allowed to abort the child? In Judaism, for instance, you are allowed to abort the child if the mother's life is in danger, just like any act of self-defense is allowed, for instance. But these are discussions within, it depends on what scenario, etc. So things, you have laws between man and him, herself. Some of them are self-evident, some of them are not so self-evident. And then laws between man and God, most of them are not self-evident. The dietary laws, kashrut, the laws of the Sabbath, the way we do it with 39 categories. A person is not going to wake up in the morning and say, okay, I don't want to eat rabbits because I don't think it's good for okay, you can look for a reason, but it wouldn't occur to you what it says in the Bible in Leviticus. So these are non-self-evident, but it doesn't mean that there's not a reason. It just means that the Torah doesn't indulge you with the reason. You have to figure it out yourself. But it is a law book and it doesn't tell you the reason. You have to break your own head and try to figure it out. But the Torah doesn't even tell you the reasons for the things that are self-evident. It just doesn't do that. You have to figure it out yourself. But so as I said, in the philosophical writings in the Middle Ages, starting from Saadia in the 10th century, they talk about this two sections or two ways of seeing the mitzvot, the self-evident and the non-self-evident, which is chok and mishpat. I want to point that out too. Okay, I think that's enough at the moment. I didn't get to the scroll of Esther. I'm sorry about that, but I just wanted to get to a few things here. Maybe one day, if I teach again the scroll of Esther, I'll write you guys an email and you can join if you want. I think I did it last year, so I might do it again this year. I hope you enjoyed the course.